This week on the agenda saw the first day of school bumping up against increasing tensions between Ontario's teachers and the provincial government, private corporations accused of hoarding their money by the Bank of Canada, and banks that are bigger and more valuable than they were after 2008's financial crisis. The agenda's Week in Review starts with Queen's Park Observer's Martin Redcon and Maria Babbage and the summer that wasn't in Ontario politics. The Orange hearings were really quite extraordinary, right? The guy everybody wanted to hear from, Chris Mazza, finally showed up.
Yeah, there was a lot of explosive testimony this summer. We had Chris Mazza, who gave a very emotional appearance before the committee, and he raised a lot of questions that still haven't been answered. We also had a visit from the ex-chairman of Orange, who made some very explosive allegations at the end of his testimony, talking about this alleged kickback scheme at Orange.
And all of that adds up to what, do you think?
Well, Orange doesn't have, we don't have a lot of answers on Orange, so a lot of it has been directed to the government. What happened? Why weren't they overseeing this organization? And those questions really haven't been answered. As well, the opposition has been demanding the health minister's head over this, and they've resisted those calls for her resignation.
And Martin, one of the things the opposition has wanted is the Premier to show up and testify at this committee. Yes. Any indication that that's going to happen?
No, I don't think it will happen unless the pressure is raised even stronger. I think it's pretty clear that the Premier's office feels it will only grant more, not ammunition, but it will put the Premier in an awkward and uncomfortable pose. You have the same feeling sometimes in the US that a president doesn't come before Congress unless he's perhaps being impeached. I think the Premier's approach in the last few weeks, or last couple of weeks since the legislature has been back, has been to say, here I am, I'm in question period, come and get me. He's now answering their questions on Orange. He didn't used to before. Previously, he would pass those questions on to his House Leader and seem to be stalling. The opposition says, well, wait a minute, that looks easy, like you're here now, but in question period, even though you're there for an hour, you can only have a fairly scripted exchange of about 30 or 60 seconds back and forth supplementaries. When you're in committee, you can't run away, you can't hide, the Speaker doesn't call a timeout, you're not saved by the bell.
We're going through all of what we're going through with the teachers right now, with two teacher unions in particular, because the government wanted not to be obligated to about $400+ million worth of salary increases that the teachers would have been entitled to. And yet, almost $200 million in unanticipated expenditure to cancel a gas plant to save some seats in I'm simplifying, but essentially to save some seats in west of Toronto. How does that math make sense?
It doesn't make sense, but I'm going to go one step further than the opposition and many of my friends in the media and say that they should not have canceled the gas plant. That won't make me very popular at Sherway Gardens and thereabouts, but I thought they should have gone ahead. This is pure NIMBYism, and the opposition doesn't say this, but they were playing the same game. They too would have canceled the plant wrongly, in my opinion, and also held us up for $190 million. So everyone was playing politics here. The Tories supported the cancellation. The NDP never wanted to build a power plant. God bless them. But I think we oversimplify when we say that this was money that the opposition somehow would have saved, or that it was a bribery scandal. What it was terrible timing. There was no reason for the Liberals to try and do it so expediently 2 weeks before an election call, 2 weeks before voting day, when they were clearly trying to save seats that, by the way, they probably would have won anyway.
Well,
so in that sense, it was a waste of money, especially.
And the finance minister did say in a committee that that they were down in the polls when they made that decision. And that was a very interesting statement by him, because it sort of adds fuel to the opposition fire that this was all about saving Liberal seats.
I think it also emerged in those hearings that it wasn't the Ministry of Energy, the Minister of Energy, or any independent report that suggested cancelling that plant. It was the campaign team. Yeah. So it was a political decision, obviously.
Mind you, parties make all kinds of promises during elections, and people know that they're going to have to pay for them someday. So it was a campaign promise. I don't think there was any wrongdoing in having a party make that call. It's just that when you're talking $190 million, you'd hope that a government would make that decision, not a party.
Let's, now having looked at what the government was up to over the summer, talk a bit about what the opposition was up to. We shouldn't assume that because the House wasn't sitting, that the two opposition leaders, Tim Hudak and Andrea Horwath, weren't working, because from time to time they were. For example, what did Tim Hudak have up this summer?
Well, Tim Hudak has been trying, I think, to make amends for the last election campaign when he was accused, I think justifiably and by his own admission, of running too much of an anti-McGuinty campaign, an anti-HST campaign, and an anti-hydro campaign, an anti-smart meter campaign, an anti-debt retirement charge campaign.
Key word here being anti.
Anti. And now he is trying to ante-up on his own and say, here's what I'm going to stand for, more or less. These are so-called white papers. It's a bit of a misuse. They're actually green papers, if you want to be a process junkie, because they are proposals by a government, which they are not yet. But they are opposition attempts to put things out there. They don't stand by them. They're discussion papers, in short. And they've already issued a couple, one on, energy, hydro, right? And one on the unions. And you could...
They call labor flexibility.
Correct, yes. So this, but to use their words, union bosses are part of the target, union membership, the right to opt out. Big talking point. Got a lot of publicity, not just in Ontario, but in national coverage, national media. And so they're trying to set an agenda, a conservative agenda, and without being held to it. So it's a clever strategy. I approve it. I use the word strategy not as a criticism. It's good to get a discussion going. And there are more coming down the pike, but that's what they've spent a lot of the summer working on.
How successfully, Maria, in your view?
I'm not sure if people have been paying attention over the summer, so I sort of wonder whether or not putting out a discussion paper in July is really the best course of action. People's attentions are drawn elsewhere. They released this labor paper the same week that we saw the mall collapse in Elliott Lake, so there wasn't a whole lot of attention paid to it, but they just continued to try and promote it over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I don't know if that message is getting through, but certainly Tim Hudak is spending as much time as he can, meeting with the party faithful and trying to convince them that he's serious, that this time it will be different the next time we go to
Does it seem to you as if he has learned the lessons, whatever they may have been, of the last election campaign?
I think he's learned some of the lessons. He still tends to stick to the script when he's speaking to reporters or when he's on camera, which is not it's really not a great way of doing things. But he's also, I think, tried to change his image a bit.
From what to what?
Well, I think during the election, people just sort of thought him as Angry Tim. He was, as you said, anti-everything. I think now he's trying to show that he has a plan, a larger plan for the province. I think he's trying to show that he can lead the province. He's not just angry about stuff. He actually has some ideas. Now, whether those ideas are simply, recycled or repackaged change book promises, I mean, that'll be up to the voters to decide. But he's certainly, in his promotional material, the photos he's using sort of give him more gravitas. I think he's really trying to show that he can be the next premier.
When Bill Clinton went after, they called it the Sister Soldier moment, right? When he went right after his base and criticized his base and ended up getting rave reviews on it because he had the guts to stand up to his base. Are Liberals interpreting this the same way? The teachers' unions have been with McGuinty for 9 straight years and very much helped him get reelected twice. Is this a Sister Soldier moment for them?
I think it is. I think there is so much emotion wrapped up in this as well, because you talk about a relationship, and when there is a difficult conversation, there's a lot of baggage that's being carried on all sides here. I think McGuinty was boxed in. The teachers have had pretty good pay raises. We've talked about this before. They've had 25% in the cumulative since the McGuinty government came to power in 2003. They've had 12% over the last 4 years, most of the unions, except for elementary teachers, because they couldn't come to terms last time.
Who could have had it had they wanted
Correct.
to, but walked away.
Instead of getting 12, they took 10. So it's time. Look, the government honored that contract during tough economic times. We're still the economy is still very sluggish. So I think we all have to agree that a tough decision had to be made. Has McGuinty handled it in the most enlightened way? I don't think so. I think he's gone a bit too far. I don't think he needed to recall the legislature early, for example, 2 weeks early, in order to ram through an anti-strike bill when no one had yet taken the decision to go on strike.
The McGuinty government's proposed Putting Students First legislation to impose contracts on teachers is being debated at Queen's Park this week. It's been called both unfair and unconstitutional. Our first guest in this, our 7th season, disagrees. And joining us now, Laurel Broden, Ontario's Minister of Education and the Liberal MPP for Etobicoke Lakeshore. Well, let's, just in case people weren't paying too much attention to this over the summertime, remind everybody of what the highlights are in your Putting Students First Act, which was introduced into the legislature last Monday. Here are the bullet points. 0% salary increases for all Ontario publicly funded school teachers in 2012-13 and 2013-14. All teachers will take a 1.5% pay cut in the form of 3 unpaid professional development days. Restructuring of the teacher pay grid for long-term sustainable savings, in other words, no backdoor increases by moving up the grid. Ending the current retirement gratuity for payment of unused sick days, that's $1.7 billion liability for school boards. And restructuring of the short-term sick leave plan that would see teachers' sick days decline to 10 from 20. And according to your ministry, the Putting Students First Act will save the province $2 billion and will avert an expenditure of $473 million, a reference to the automatic pay increases that would go into effect if this bill didn't pass. First question, why do this?
Well, we began this conversation with our partners in education some months ago because we've known that collective agreements expire on August 31st. With the need to negotiate a new collective agreement, one of the things that we certainly saw on the horizon was the reality that within the Ministry of Education budget, we were going to have to make some choices. Don Drummond, for example, gave us some advice some months ago that we shouldn't roll out full-day kindergarten and that we should let our class sizes go up.
You rejected that advice.
We rejected that, and both of those things would have led to teachers being fired because you wouldn't have needed as many teachers if you didn't have full-day kindergarten and your class sizes went up. Our choices were that we would maintain those jobs, 10,000 teaching jobs, 10,000 support worker jobs, that we would put our investments in our classrooms, and what we needed to ask our partners in education for in this collective agreement period was for a pay freeze and to see the end to bankable sick days, which you don't get sick, you don't use those days, and then you cash them out at the end. And so we started that negotiation some 6 months ago. We reached agreement now with 55,000 teachers, and it's on that agreement, on the basis of that agreement, that the Putting Students First Act is based.
The school boards usually hammer out these agreements with their own teachers individually all over the province. Why this time did the province feel a need to step in and do something on a province-wide basis?
So this is the same process that we've followed for the last 2 sets of collective agreements since we've formed government under Premier McGuinty, putting a real focus on ensuring that education across the province is consistent. We've had something called a provincial discussion table, and it is that framework agreement that we take the lead for and we negotiate, and that's the same structure that we've taken in this conversation.
Here's what the allegation is. If the government doesn't legislate contracts, teachers will receive a 5.5% wage increase. The elementary teachers say that's just false, that only 40% of their teachers would receive an increase, so that you are essentially beating a drum that's not making any noise right now. Who's right on this?
We've always said it's only those portion of teachers who are moving up through the grid. I think for Ontarians who don't know this area inside out, it's important to know that teachers move through a process where they get recognized for their qualifications and experience. On the whole, about 40% of the teachers are continuing to move through the grid. About 60% of the teachers are at the top of the grid. So it is only those that are moving through the grid. That's the agreement that we reached with the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association, was to say, you know what, we don't want the burden of the fiscal challenges to be borne only by our youngest teachers. We want everyone to share in that burden. That's why we moved away from a grid freeze to a partial grid freeze to the 1.5% pay cut of all teachers, so that even those teachers at the high end who would not be moving through the grid would pay for the movement of younger teachers. And I think it was a very demonstrated strong leadership on the part of that union to say we need to support our young teachers, because we all know young teachers who have been waiting, have worked hard to find that first job.
You also promised a full grid review next time, didn't you, for the Catholic teachers?
Across the entire system, we do need to review the grid. Joining us now, Ken Coran. He's the president of the OSSTF, and we welcome you here for your first visit on the agenda and to TVO. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
But you know that, I mean, their view on this is we've basically given you guys everything you've wanted over the past 9 years. Now we're asking for 2 years of freeze, period, full stop, and you're giving us a rough time.
Well, so here's where some of the numbers that are being quoted are somewhat misleading. I did say that we accepted the 2-year wage freeze. The part we had a problem with was the grid movement, which we believe all our newer members are entitled to. So if we could come up with a way, working with the local school boards, to achieve financial savings to pay for that grid movement, should that not have an opportunity to be discussed? And I would say yes. I think most people would say yes. There's a problem, let's talk about it, let's solve it. So that is a process that we're undertaking with the local school boards, is to see if we could find those savings. And if we can, why should we discredit something that was freely collectively bargained? I mean, the fact that roughly 39% of all educational workers are in that grid situation. So 61% of educational workers, when you talk about the wage freeze, that is a true wage freeze. It's this 39% that even have any entitlement to grid movement. So the financial savings, I think they really equate to about $150 million. We believe we could find those savings.
The government's position on this, though, Mr. Cran, has been that we had to pass this back-to-work legislation for 2 reasons. Number one, we couldn't risk having that $400+ million worth of added expenditure to teacher salaries come in. And number two, we had to be sure you guys would be there in the classroom to start with. What's your reaction to that?
Well, we stated time and time again that our members would be in the classrooms in September. There was never any doubt of that. And very recently, they were using the fact that we were going to take strike votes as ammunition, I would say, to justify their position. And we even decided to delay any strike votes, to postpone them, just to show the public that we were serious about this, that we would be in the schools, we would be fulfilling our duties, and improving student achievement, just as always.
Okay, but my recollection is, you correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection was you gave those undertakings to the government after they tabled this bill.
No, that's not true.
You gave it to them before.
Yeah, we stated all along from day one with regards to strike votes. A strike vote is something that's guaranteed under the Ontario Labour Relations Act. And this whole process is somewhat in contravention to the Labour Relations Act. We said a strike vote is designed to do one thing: determine your members' support for a particular position. It doesn't mean you're going to strike. It doesn't mean a strike is in the plans. It means you're gauging your members' support, and that's what the strike vote was designed to do. But
it is a move from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3, if you like. I mean, it gets you closer to war.
Sure, but under the Labour Relations Act, before you could get to the DEFCON system, you would have to apply for a conciliator, which is a 10-day period to have a conciliator appointed. And then after the conciliator is appointed, you would have to apply for a no board report.
Okay, so in other words,
it wasn't 17 more days.
It wasn't a provocation in your view.
It was certainly not an antagonistic or a confrontational situation.
Okay. 9 years of goodwill between the Liberal government and Ontario's teacher union seems to have evaporated in just 6 months. How did this collapse happen so quickly? Well, here's Michael Decter, who negotiated the social contract 20 years ago for then Premier Bob Rae, and Doug Little, former Toronto School Board trustee and the editor of the Little Education Report.
They've set an object that they're going to tackle 20% of the electorate that works in the public sector or the broader public sector. That 20% of the electorate is going to cost them major party status in the future. They're going to be reduced to being a minor party because they made this decision.
Or not, or the electorate could look at it and say, way to go, sticking up for us and sticking it to them.
In April, the government went into third place with the teachers' contracts in front of them. Since they announced what they're going to do, they've become the third place party on the average of all the polls, and they're staying there at 26 or 27%. It is not a popular thing to do to take on the public sector. The people who like it are already taken. They're all conservatives. Yeah. The people who don't like it will turn on you big time.
Michael?
Well, the party that's gained the most ground over the last number of years in Ontario is the party that wanted a full legislated freeze of the entire public sector, which actually would have been fairer in some ways, because you've got this extraordinary amount of animosity generated and extreme views. And I have to say to Doug Little, I went on your website today just to get some insight. You've got a picture of the elected premier of our province, a picture of Benito Mussolini, and a comparison of the two, which was so offensive to me that I was startled by it. I mean, you've got a man who was elected to govern our province, democratic election, maybe unelected. You would hope he would, I wouldn't, but, and you've got him compared to a man who was a dictator of a fascist state. There isn't, and you're in the education business, there isn't a scintilla of similarity between their careers, these two men, their beliefs.
Do you want to defend
How
this,
can you
Doug?
put that
Sure.
up?
Anytime.
I think you should take it down and apologize.
Defend away.
Defend away. The legislation is totalitarian. From the perspective of unions, from the perspective of workers, collective bargaining is at the same level as freedom of speech and free democratic elections. It's at the same level. You take it away, you're a totalitarian.
Well, except it's not. If you look in the Constitution, freely, collectively bargaining agreements is not up there with speech and religion and assembly and
But
so on.
I said
not there at all.
from the perspective of workers, free collective bargaining is at the same level. That's why it's a totalitarian legislation. Who takes it away?
The democratically elected representatives of the population are overwhelmingly voting for this. So definitionally, it can't be totalitarian. Totalitarian means you've got a dictatorship. These are people that we elected as citizens who are taking, I think, a very sensible decision. You may not like their decision, but there's no stretch of the imagination that turns this into fascism or totalitarianism.
There
That's
is to me.
bizarre.
Mr. Manley, it's good to have you on the line there. How are you tonight?
I'm just great. Thank you, Steve.
Terrific. I want to read something that the Globe and Mail published last month just to set up our discussion here, and then we'll go from there. Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney has taken a rare swing at corporate Canada, accusing companies of sitting on huge piles of dead money that should be invested productively or returned to investors. Mr. Carney acknowledged that companies are wary about the global economy's prospects because of debt problems in Europe, but he said Canadian executives are underestimating the resolve of the central bank and other authorities to guard against a financial crisis. Answering questions after a speech to the Canadian auto workers, Mr. Carney suggested that with hundreds of billions of dollars in their bank accounts, Canadian firms aren't doing enough to drive economic growth and create new jobs. Quote, "The level of caution could be viewed as excessive," he said. Referring to corporate managers, he added, "Their job is to put money to work, and if they can't think of what to do with it, they should give it back to their shareholders." Let's start there. How do you respond to the accusation that Canadian firms aren't doing enough to drive economic growth and create new jobs?
Well, of course, I have huge respect for Governor Carney, and I think we're all very proud of the job that he does internationally as head of the Bank of Canada. It's interesting, Steve, just within days of his comments at a Canadian auto workers meeting, the GDP numbers came out that showed some modest growth, and credited most of that growth to business investment. So clearly businesses are investing as well as accumulating cash. And I think the accumulation of cash is quite understandable given the threat circumstances that exist in the world. A lot of risk, a lot of worry, and what I felt a little bruised about was the governor's comment that cash that was retained on the balance sheet was dead money. It's a little bit like an insurance policy. If you never need to make a claim, I guess you could look at those premiums as being wasted or dead money. But most of us buy insurance because the day that you need it, you really need it.
This was a bit of a tag team operation, if you like, because Governor Carney on one day said what he had to say, and then not very far after that, Jim Flaherty, the finance minister, a job you know about since you used to have it, said it was up to the private sector to get off its butt, so to speak, and get out there and start stimulating the economy, that he's done as much as he can or is prepared to do with his stimulus program. Is that a fair statement, what the finance minister had to say?
Well, first of all, I mean, you're right, having had that job and working closely with the governor of the Bank of Canada, I mean, their concerns are different from the concerns of business leaders. They have a different responsibility. Of course, when you're the finance minister, you want businesses to be creating jobs. But businesses don't actually exist to create jobs. They actually exist in order to make profits on behalf of their shareholders, and that's got to be their principal responsibility. Otherwise, CEOs find themselves out of work. So that's not what they're there for. On the other hand, we do keep nudging Minister Flaherty on some of the things that he could do. Federally regulated businesses, for example, are facing very serious constraints around funding of pension plans. He could do more to alleviate that, and that would actually free up some of that so-called dead cash that doesn't go into further investment in machinery, equipment, or infrastructure. He's taken quite a whack out of large Canadian companies that do research and development in his last budget. So it would be good to align the policy with the results that he wants, particularly when it comes to the large business sector in Canada.
So when a finance minister basically says, come on, corporate Canada, get off your butts and get out there and start creating some jobs, is he in fact spitting into the breeze?
Well, it's good politics. I may have done a little bit of them myself in my time, Steve. Who knows? But the reality is, and for the most part, Minister Flaherty stresses this, creating the right policy environment in which business can make investments is really the principal job of the government. And I think the fact that Canada has seen the results that it has been seeing, I mean, really we lead the world for the most part by most measures, is a result of a very steady and very sensible policy environment that successive federal governments have been creating for Canadian business, and the results are there.
Do you suspect that Canadians really do think that their big companies in particular have a job, which is to help create more jobs?
Well, that may be one way to try to express it, but you know, CEOs and their boards of directors face a democratic process as well. Mr. Flaherty has to face elections every few years where he goes to see the voters who at their doorsteps. Well, owners of companies also have democratic rights. And we have experience in this country where corporate managers and their boards of directors might say, yes, but we've created jobs. And the shareholders say, you may have created some jobs, but our returns are lagging what they should be, and we're going to make a change.
And we now bring you two more voices on this subject. Mike Moffat is a professor of business, economics, and public policy at the Richard Ivey School of Business at Western University in London, Ontario. And Armin Yalnizyan is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And Armin, we welcome you back. And Mike, nice to have you in that chair for the first time.
Thank you for having me.
You know, one of the things that John Manley said, and has been on the table for discussion, and the big banks did it just a week or two ago, put the dividends out there.
Yeah, but I said that. So you give the money back to investors.
Oh, in that respect, okay.
And they're going to put it where? Into another corporation that doesn't know where to put the money, which is quite rational, because why would I invest in expanding my plant when nobody's buying anything?
So that's not going to get it done, you think?
No, in fact, what will happen is you give it back to the, you know, governments said to us in 15 years of tax cuts, you know what to do with your money better than us. Let's give you back your money. So we've deferred infrastructure investments and all sorts of other things that we should have been doing. And now businesses are saying, we don't know what to do with the money. Let's give it back to you. You decide what to do with the money. In fact, there are things we need to do to save our costs down the road. I'm going to say this one more time. In 5 to 10 years, the cost of labor is going to go up and the cost of borrowing money is going to go up. We're going to be sticking ourselves with a bill that we don't need to be paying more money from. As a businessman, you should be saying this is a crazy way of using our money. We should actually be investing now to actually get the benefit of it now, but also and we've got fallow labor.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, and that's what businesses are doing. Again, investment's going up 7, 8, 9% per year. Consumer spending is not going up 8, 9% a year. Government spending is not going up. If governments and consumers were increasing their spending at the rate of corporations, we wouldn't have this problem.
But is she right that when companies give money back in the terms of, you know, increased dividends for shareholders, that those shareholders tend not to do anything with it, and it doesn't add to the economic activity we're hoping for?
Well, not in this environment. I'm not saying they don't tend to. They would tend to, but not in this environment.
I think you could make that argument because most of those people who own those shares are disproportionately wealthier, so they're more likely to save it than somebody in the middle or lower class.
So she's right, it doesn't help.
It doesn't hurt. Let's put it. It may not be.
How does it not hurt if you're just shifting around the decks on the chairs on the deck and the ship's going down because nobody's doing anything to right it? But it can be righted.
They are bigger and more valuable since the financial crisis. With their size comes greater risk. Is it time to break up the big banks? Joining us now on that, in Washington, D.C., Mark Calabria. He's Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. Sanford Weill, former chairman, Citigroup, said America should separate investment banking from commercial banking. Everything old is new again. Go back to the way things used to be. And of course, he was one of the guys who argued this should be put together. Now, given what's happened, he says better to pull it apart. Do you think, let's go, Mark, to you first on this. Do you think that would solve or at least curb the amount of inappropriate behavior we've been seeing at the big banks over the last 4 years?
Let me first reiterate the point about policy being evidence-based. And so I'm somebody who does start from the premise of if you've provided a government safety net via deposit insurance or too big to fail, whatever that, it's certainly an important role of the government to restrict the moral hazard and risk-taking that safety net creates. Now, I would say that I think the ultimate objective should be to try to scale back some of that safety net in terms of the expansiveness of deposit inserts and such. But that said, you should therefore look at activities and say, do these activities make it riskier or they make it less risky? And quite frankly, at this point, for me, you could get me to the point where I'm convinced that Glass-Steagall is the way to go, but I just don't think the evidence that I've seen is yet compelling, partly because if you look at the institutions in the U.S., I mean, Bear Stearns, Lehman, these were standalone investment banks. Certainly Fannie and Freddie weren't even banks. You look at the U.S. banks that did get in trouble, who did mix the two, banks like Wachovia or WAMU, they got in trouble because of their commercial lending side. So the fact is, it's hard for me to look at actual examples of where, if we had implemented this, that you would have seen a different worldview. And again, there are other countries where you do have so-called universal banking that did not have some of the same problems that we had. So again, it's not necessarily clear to me. And you can also think of examples, for instance, JP Morgan's a great example of, they started to see losses on their commercial side, their commercial bank side from their mortgage portfolio, and then they went over and talked to their investment guys and said, you need to start looking at mortgages and get out of this. And it did inform their investment bank, and so having the two probably saved the whole. So again, it's not clear to me necessarily that separating investment from commercial banking is going to be the solution. I'm actually quite sure that if we had it, it probably wouldn't have made a dime's worth of difference.
Okay, you dropped a phrase there that, again, I'm glad we've got the professor here to help us with a little business 101 here, the Glass-Steagall Act, which if you've been following this, everybody knows what it is, but if you haven't, you're going to tell us what it is.
It's an act that goes back to the Great Depression, which basically creates this wall between commercial banking, the banking sort of you and I do, and investment banking. That was lifted in the 1990s, again, this is a U.S. act, to allow those to come together. And one of the
under Bill Clinton's administration.
Under Clinton's administration, yep. And one of the arguments for allowing this to come together was that it would create additional efficiencies, that these companies would be more efficient. But one of the arguments against it at the time was it would create more these moral hazard type problems.
Which it did.
The con's looking, the con side's looking very prescient at this point.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.